Hello and welcome to Broken Entertainment. So today I want to have a little conversation about language and world building. We all are familiar with the famous example of J.R.R. Tolkien writing a complete language from the ground up for the elves and other races in his setting, where you could actually learn the language, you could learn to write it, you could learn to speak it. The only thing that didn't make it a real world language, of course, was a real world application. Most authors, of course, don't have this level of sophistication with being able to write their own language, let alone the desire to spend the time on it. Whereas for Tolkien, it was a hobby, it was something he deeply enjoyed. But nonetheless, language, even though your book is in English or whatever your native language is, language plays a major role in informing culture and how people communicate and talk to one another. When you're talking about sci-fi and fantasy settings with diverse nations and cultures, they're going to have different languages. That language is going to change how they understand concepts, how they approach concepts and thinking. If you look at Western languages versus, say, Japanese or Japanese or Chinese or Korean, they're structured completely differently, and they're not even written the same way. English, for example, English, Italian, German, French have distinct letters, whereas Japanese, Chinese, Korean, etc. have sort of pictograph letters that have different meanings and can totally change the meaning of a sentence based on how they're done. And oftentimes, as authors, the way we incorporate this is by specific word use. We'll include a foreign word that is to represent the language without having to actually write out the language. But also there are different ways of writing that come into play. And for me, I was working on the world building for my fantasy novel, and one of the races in it is called the Mare, and they're essentially a mermaid race. And what always bugs me in anything containing mermaids or underwater civilizations is everybody talks, which doesn't work underwater very well because the way you process sound and the way sound works in water is totally different. And everybody, if you even see written records, they're just somehow magically written like normal. And I did some research, and a friend of mine pointed me in the direction that there are civilizations in our world that have had records kept that were not written. Quipu is an example of one, or Kipu is an example of one from South America, and it's a series of knots and beads on strings that recorded information, and there were also people whose specialization in life was the oral side of the record, because the records could be complex enough that you would also have an oral history attached to it. And that, to me, was really interesting. I'm like, that's how an underwater civilization could record their language. Because they're not going to write letters. It doesn't work underwater. And there's no reason for them to try to create a language that works underwater in the form of written on paper or stone or what have you, because they've always lived underwater. And that's the kind of little bit of world building detail that can go such a long way. Because when you have a character who is from a surface civilization receive a message from a non-surface civilization, in this case, and it comes in the form of either a letter or the Kipu, those are meaningful things. If they took the time to make it a letter, it shows they had to come to the surface to write it. They had the dedication to figure out this other language, to learn this other language, to communicate with this person from a completely different culture. Or if they sent the quipu, it means they expected the other person to know their language. And there's a lot that both of those directions say about the cultures involved. And I just think it's really interesting, and something to consider when you write and when you world build is, how are these people communicating? Because different cultures, of course, communicate in completely different ways. And if you take, for example, the Disney movie Pocahontas, at the beginning of the movie, you have two civilizations that are completely incapable of communicating, and they sort of magic hand wave that away later on, and that's something to consider. And the same with Star Trek. You have all these different races that have their own languages, but they communicate using a common language, or using, in the case of Star Trek, a universal translator. That's the technology that they all kind of have. I think it's more interesting and compelling as world building to have these languages all be different. And you don't have to explain it. You don't have to go into huge detail and exposition about this writing. You see the differences immediately if someone gets a quipu, for example, where you're like, oh wow, that race doesn't use paper, they don't write, but they have complex communications. They're advanced enough to have a form of recording information, and it all makes sense because they live underwater. It's just another aspect of world building that we should all consider, because we think of world building as being these huge details. How the magic system works, how the continents are laid out, how the civilizations came into being. But a lot of information can be sent to the reader without exposition, or with limited exposition, in the small little details, like written records, and like the differences between languages, and the differences in culture that arise from them, or that gave birth to those differences in language. And you don't have to say it. You can just show it. And being able to show complexity through simple example is what really sets apart some of the writers that are writing today. Brandon Sanderson being a great example of that. In The Way of Kings, for example, there's a lot of cultural differences that are shown without being big, huge, complex, in-depth examinations of the culture. It's just, this guy speaks differently because he comes from here. And so the way his speech patterns are written is completely different from somebody else's. It gives you a sense of that language barrier without having to do any major exposition about, well, this culture lives this far away and this culture is over here, and so they don't have it, blah, 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 blah. So it's something that I like to do. I like to talk about world building. I like to do world building when I can. It's not something I always have time for in a day, but definitely something to consider. The major, I'll call them major little details. Language, gender roles, and holidays all tell a great deal about a culture without having to do the big blocks of exposition nobody wants to read and nobody wants to write. So if you liked the video, please hit the like button. Consider subscribing to the channel if you aren't, and I will see you next time.